without further ado, I'm today very excited to welcome Richard Hurowitz, celebrating the release of In the Garden of Righteous, the heroes who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Richard Hurowitz is a writer and the founder and publisher of Octavian Report. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Times UK, Los Angeles Times, Time Magazine, History Today, and the Jerusalem Post. There we go. Wow. I don't know why I got hung up on that one. Among other publications. He has received his bachelor's degree in history from Yale University and his Juris Doctor from Columbia Law School. He currently lives in New York City with his family. Hurowitz will be joined in conversation with Michael J. Abramowitz, the president of Freedom House, a nonpartisan voice dedicated to supporting democracy. He has previously directed the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Levine Institute for Holocaust Education, prior to which he led the museum's genocide prevention efforts. He spent the first 24 years of his career at the Washington Post, where he was a national editor and then White House correspondent. So please join me today in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Richard Hurowitz and Michael J. Abramowitz.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Welcome, Richard, and first of all, congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
As someone who has, over the course of my time at the Holocaust Museum, read a fair amount of stories about the righteous Gentiles, this is really an incredible book. And I think with the exception maybe of Schindler, many of these stories are not well known in the general public, and so hopefully this will be an opportunity to bring them to a much wider audience. So I thought we could start maybe, actually with the title. Where did the title come from? Did you have Eric Larson's book in mind at all when you came up with that title?
It's funny. Is my microphone's on? Yeah, everyone can.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. First of all, also just wanted to thank everyone for coming out today. I really appreciate it. This is the first event we're having for the book, and thank you, Mike, for doing this. We do amazing work at Freedom House that hopefully fighting every day to prevent anything happening ever again, like the Second World War. We did publish the book. You may have noticed there's another book that came out this week about a prince, and I will just say that Prince Harry's great, but his great grandmother, Princess Alice, is in my book and was a righteous among the nations, and so I hope the book sells as well as his does, because her story is much better, and she saved a family in her house in Athens, right across the street from the Gestapo. But you asked about the title. The title is a subject, as you probably know, anybody who's written a book, of sort of conversation that goes on with your publisher and your agent. And the Garden of the Righteous, for those of you who may or may not be familiar, is a place at Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem. And it's been there from the beginning. One of the missions of that institution from its founding was actually to honor people who risked their lives to save Jews. And part of the tradition is, if you receive this award, and there have been 27,000 people to date who've received it, and the criteria is quite stringent. A tree is planted in your honor. So if you go to the museum and you walk through the garden, it's called the Garden of the Righteous, and many of the people, but not all, who were featured in the book have trees there. So yes, and something about it, books within the garden seem to have done well over time. But the Garden of the Righteous is a real place in Jerusalem.
Richard, tell us a little bit about how you came to this subject, because you have been, I think, a lot of your career, you went to law school, you were in finance for a long time, then you started your own democracy organization, you were a publisher. This is your first book. How did you latch onto this subject? So
I opened the book with answering that question. There's more than one answer. I'd say the real origin of it actually started here in Washington. I'm a New Yorker, but when I was in college, the Holocaust Memorial Museum opened on the Mall, and my family came down. And I'm from a family that my wife's in-laws were actually Holocaust survivors, but my family has been here for a long time. But you know, we made the pilgrimage down there, and if you've been through the museum, it's a very, very, very enervating, difficult experience. You know, to see, intentionally so, you know, how horrible the Holocaust was. And for me at the time, you know, I was a kind of sophomore in college. It was very, you know, difficult. Like, you came out to this room where they had a small room featuring the righteous, and I remember there was a story, particularly this photograph of a young guy with a pipe. His name was Alexander Schmorl, and he was part of a group called the White Rose, who were mostly medical students. There was a brother and a sister, Hans and Sophie Scholl, and the core group was 6 people, and they tried to sort of foment a student uprising, and an uprising against Hitler's regime. A lot of what they talked about was, this is not the Germany that we know. They came from a kind of very unusual family. They were religious, but they also really believed in liberal democracy, which I know, Mike, you do so much work on. And so they were really they started publishing pamphlets. They were also among the first people to publicize the Holocaust, actually. They had the guy with the pipe actually wrote, there have been already several 100,000 Jews killed in the most bestial way. So this went on for, you know, they were underground, and they were publishing, and they would send them to students, they'd leave them in phone books, send them to people's homes. And then one day they were at this university, and they were handing out leaflets, and the janitor saw them, and he was an ardent Nazi, locked the door, turned them in. Within days, they were put on trial. Hitler sent his personal judge down, and they were executed, for 3, and then they captured the other 3. And that story always stayed with me. I actually thought about doing my senior thesis at Yale on it, but I didn't know German, and I always remembered it. And then I was working on another project. It was this future book project about a relative of mine who was at the Nuremberg trials as a prosecutor, and I found a story about how they tried to bring Jews. It was completely unknown. There was a plan to bring Jews to the Virgin Islands, which are U.S. territory, 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, and it was blocked by the State Department. And I got a huge response to this article, which I published in the Wall Street Journal, and I started publishing, mostly on op-ed pages, articles about different righteous, and there was a big response to it. I think people were really looking for stories of inspiration and heroism, and so the book grew out of that. It's a very undercovered area for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about, in Holocaust studies and in history, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But to me, these stories are, you know, among the most heroic in world history. And there's someone, you know, who was early on trying to recognize them, made a comment like, how is it that everyone knows who Himmler is, and everyone knows who Goering is, but nobody knows who Aristides de Sousa Mendes is, who may have saved as many as 30,000 people. So historical injustice. So the book is written a little bit as well out of gratitude to these people, and to try to also try to understand also what lessons we can learn from what they did, you know, what caused people to do this, and you know, how we can make the world a better place.
So we'll get to some of those lessons, which I think are interesting. But you mentioned that roughly 27,000 righteous Gentiles are recognized in the garden at Yad Vashem, but you had 10 stories you told. So how did you what was the criteria for picking the stories that you focus on?
There was no magic formula. I tried to pick stories that spoke to me. It was difficult. My initial book proposal would probably have been 4 times the length of this. So I tried to, in the introduction, I talk a little bit about stories that you know, are not covered comprehensively in the book. But I tried to also pick a mix of different types of people, different countries, different motivations, for why people did rescue, to try to capture. Every story is different, but a panoply. Some of the people in here also, like Susan Mendez and like the country of Denmark, were very, they were large rescue efforts, and they affected a lot of people. Although there's some where one of the chapters is rescued one teenage girl. So that there was no, I also picked stories that I thought were interesting as stories, and were sort of either set piece or cinematic, and had some color to them. So there's a story of a rescue in a circus, and there's a story of an Italian cyclist, and there's there's a number of stories that take place in France during the invasion. So part of it is I'd like hope people find the book to be a good read as well.
Well, it is a good read, so I think you achieved something there. We don't want to like spoil all the stories, but for your prospective readers. But was there any individual that really spoke to you, that kind of whispered in your ear as you did this project, that kind of pushed you on in the writing of this project?
Yeah, it's like asking you like which of your children, in that case, I have two children. I love them equally, truly. There are a few, they're all amazing. There's something about Susan Mendez, the Portuguese consul, that's just extraordinarily powerful. It's the story I opened the book with. He was a diplomat. He was an aristocrat, and his twin brother was the foreign minister under Salazar, who was the sort of a very complicated guy, because he was Portugal, like Spain, was neutral, and in the beginning of the war he was sort of more sympathetic to the Germans, and then later in the war switched. But he was very Machiavellian, and his main goal was to keep Portugal out of the war and Spain out of the war, and he was like adamant that there not be refugees let in. And Portugal, being neutral, was a place, if you got to it, you generally could get out to other places like the United States. And so they had sent pretty strong directives to the diplomats on the ground not to allow people in, particularly Jews. And so Susan Mendez, the diplomat, he was sort of the bon vivant of this. His brother was very serious. He was this amazing. He was a part of the diplomatic corps. He was an amazing entertainer. He had 14 children, and he was very colorful guy, very devout Catholic as well. Although he believed he was descended, as many Portuguese are, from conversos. And during when the invasion of France happened in June of 1940, he was the consul general in Bordeaux, and as you may know, there was a huge exodus down towards the south, millions of people. It's probably the greatest traffic jam in the history of humanity, and horrific scenes with German planes overhead and people seeing their families killed, and it was just a nightmare. And he was down. People would go when they got to the south in places like Bordeaux, door to door to every consulate, United States, slam the door. Pretty much every country slammed the door. And he went out into the street, and he met a young rabbi from Poland, but who had lived in Belgium, where Susan Mendez had been posted for a while. And the guy also had a large family, and he sort of said, "Why don't you come stay in the you don't sleep on the street. Come stay in the consulate." Susan Mendez sent all of his children, but his two oldest boys, to back to Portugal. And so they came there, and he says, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And he offered to get him a visa, and the rabbi said to him, "I can't leave I couldn't do that. I need everyone to do this." And Susan Mendez had a very dramatic moment. He took to his bed for a couple of days, and then he got up and he said, "I'm going to give a visa to anybody who wants this." And he said, "I would rather stand with God against man than man against God." And he then went over a period of about 3 weeks, issued, they don't know the exact number, but it was several thousand visas, and each visa was for a family, so it may have been as many as 30,000 people he saved. And so most of them were just poor refugees, but he also saved the Habsburg family, the Rothschilds. He saved the people who wrote Curious George, who were carrying the manuscript with them. He saved Salvador Dali. He saved Paul Rosenberg, who was Picasso and Matisse's art dealer. And today, there are, and I've been in contact with, there are, have to be at least, 100,000 people alive because of what he did. And subsequently, he was summoned back to Lisbon. They were livid with him. They dismissed him, fired him, brought him up on charges. He was, his pension was reduced. He went through his entire life savings, died penniless, wife died prematurely, and it was just a very sad ending. And the family spent many years trying to get him rehabilitated, but it wasn't. The United States actually honored him in 1988, way before Portugal did. But now he's a hero in Portugal, and there's a thriving democracy there. And there's something about his kindness and the way he dealt with these people and what drove him and some of the ways he talked about it and the price he paid for it that was just extremely powerful.
Well, let's just pick up on that issue of the price he paid, because I think that's also a really interesting through line of a lot of the stories. So two of my favorites in your book are, one, Sugihara, the Japanese diplomat who saved a lot of Jews in Lithuania, where my family comes from, and then also Varian Fry and Hiram Bingham, who saved thousands of Jews in southern France, and many of them also quite famous, including, I believe, Marc Chagall. So both those stories and the story of the Portuguese diplomat point to the fact that each of these chapters, the people who saved these lives kind of went on to pretty miserable post-Holocaust experiences. They were kind of rejected by their own homelands. They found it hard. I think Varian Fry suffered from deep depression, I think from your book, as recounted in your book. What explains that? And then this phenomenon, like we're 50 years later, then people got to get and say, oh, that guy did something interesting. Where Warren Christopher, then gave posthumously to Hiram Bingham an award. So that's an interesting through line of all these stories.
Yes, it is, and it's a shame. It's not universal. Universally, I think you can see that if you read the book, that almost none of these people ever bragged about what they did or took credit for it. But some people, had other, like the Italian cyclist, he had but there are many people who suffered for what they did. And I think with the diplomats, part of the reason is that they were breaking their orders, they were breaking the chain of command, and their home countries didn't take very kindly to that, including the United States. Fry was not Varian Fry, who has been recognized as a righteous, although he had an amazing team around him, including Hiram Bingham, who was worked for the State Department and was really the only consul. He and one other, Miles Standish, who's a direct descendant of the Miles Standish, the only ones who were stamping visas. And they actually rescued, they're part of a group that Eleanor Roosevelt was set up to rescue the intelligentsia. So it was all the surrealists, Marc Chagall, Marcel Duchamp, many German writers, politicians. But Fry too was expelled by the United States government. Technically by Vichy, but at the behest of the United States government, because they were making us. The theory was that we were neutral. He was making us look bad to Vichy France and to the Nazis. And so he came back and was, sort of had a very difficult time after that. Hiram Bingham was effectively forced out of the State Department, had a similar, decline to Susan Mendez. Also had a very large family. Sugihara, who was a Japanese diplomat and probably an intelligence officer, he was dismissed from the foreign ministry. At one point, he was going door to door selling light bulbs to support his family. There are other people. I mean, there's anybody who rescued in what became behind the Iron Curtain. It was a separate issue where most governments there, because of institutional anti-Semitism, because many of these people also were part of the Allied underground, and not necessarily communist. It was very dangerous to be recognized for this. So people who got the medal from Israel would find it in people's drawers. But the other thing is that to be a rescuer, I mean, we talk about 27,000 people out of 500 million. in Europe. So this is a tiny fraction. I mean, even if you multiply by 100, you're talking about, it's a tiny fraction of people who did this. And what the experience that many had, including Oskar Schindler, after the war. I mean, Wallenberg would disappear into a Soviet cell. I mean, it is almost universal. I mean, Schindler, they would throw rocks at on the street of Germany. He was punched somebody who called him a Jew lover, and the guy sued him, and he was forced to pay a fine. But a lot of people, after the war, they said, well, why did you do this? First of all, you could have gotten, us in trouble. You put everyone at risk. Why did you? Who likes the Jews? Why did you do? Why would you? There was a lot of ingrained anti-Semitism there, and so a lot of people were quite angry with the rescuers. And I think also, which is important, is after the war, people looked at the rescuers and said, well, it doesn't make us look very good, the fact that these people did this, because we should have done that. And so it's kind of an indictment of everybody who did nothing, which of course was very many people. And interestingly, in Germany, Hitler had a secretary who was the same age as Sophie Scholl from the White Rose, and she was interviewed after the war. She saw a quote from Sophie Scholl, and she saw they were born the same year, and she said, actually, I had no excuse for what I did. And Germany has been better than other countries in terms, I think, of addressing these issues, and there are many schools named after the Scholls there, because that's kind of what they want, people to think of as how people behaved during the war. But of course, they were the significant minority. So I do think that's the most universal and profound reason was that people really resented rescuers, because it's very hard to say we had to go along with it, we didn't have a choice, when these people are kind of object lessons in the fact that everyone did have a choice.
Let's talk about the motivations and the characteristics of the rescuers. And you sort of touch upon this at the end of the book, but give us a little bit of a précis about what were the characteristics of the people who chose to rescue? What were there through lines between the various characters that you saw, and that might also help us think about some lessons possibly from the stories?
So, I'll start with the psychological research that was done, and as I mentioned earlier, these stories are very undertold because in the years after the war, everyone was interested in why people went along with this, why they perpetrated it. There were the Milgram experiments at Yale. There was the Stanford prison experiment, and then of course people were interested in the victims and recording their stories. So very little work was actually done on rescuers. There were a couple of psychological studies that were done which aren't very satisfying, but one which was probably the most comprehensive. They had a lot of difficulty finding any common denominators other than how you were disciplined as a child. So people who were disciplined by their parents in a loving way, in a way which parent explains to the child what they did wrong and why, those people tended to have this altruistic instinct, and the contrast to the authoritarian personality often is correlated with people whose parents were used physical violence, were irrational, and just would punish people and snap at them. So that was the one taking away from that. I do think, in addition, having a parent or a role model as a young child who was believed in tolerance, believed in not necessarily even liking the other, but that all people there's a kind of universal brotherhood, people who were exposed to people different than themselves, and whose parent was someone who would stand up for what was right. That definitely, almost all of the rescuers would talk about somebody who had a major impact on them and the way they thought about things as a child. I think also, when you ask me, when I look at there are definitely certain themes I saw. I mean, for one, it's interesting because the church has been controversial, but it is hard to argue with the fact that the single, whatever your belief, religion was a major theme for a lot of people, and it was people who really took to heart things like, I am my brother's keeper. The parable of the Good Samaritan probably saved more people than anything else, and less people were interested in the church as a hierarchical, whatever church it was, or Muslim, but people who really took those teachings to heart and believed in that. That was a belief in something bigger, whether it was a code of honor, liberal democracy. I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of people, like diplomats, like the circus, were in international professions where they met people from all over the world. They were friends with people from all over the world. People who tended to be in creative professions also had more of a likelihood of doing this. And then of course there were certain communities that just as a whole came together, which was kind of a whole separate set of lessons. But I would say if there was one takeaway of everything, the impact that you can have on your child is the most important. And then another thing, when they studied these people, they tended to be people who thought for themselves and had strong self-esteem, and were made decisions not based on what other people told them, but on what their inner conscience told them was right.
A number of your stories involve, as you said earlier, the role of communities. So, Les Chambons in France, the Danes saving most of the Jews. I think you also alluded to the fact that Albania saved almost every one of their 200 Jews. So there were countries, not just individuals, who kind of stepped up. Again, so a similar question. What was it about Denmark that caused them to try to protect their neighbors, whereas Hungary or other countries chose to turn them over to the Nazis?
It's a really interesting question. I don't think there's one answer that covers all of these communities. I wrote an article in last weekend's Wall Street Journal about this topic. The Danish story is amazing because the entire country came together and rescued 99% of the Jews. And the Danes, like the Albanians, there was kind of virtually no history there of religious or any other kind of bigotry. It had been outlawed several hundred years earlier. There had been Jews. There was a small Jewish community, but it had been there for hundreds of years. It were mostly descendants of people who were expelled from Spain. They were called the Viking Jews, and they were just considered part of the community. People didn't think of them as, they knew they were Jewish, but they viewed them as fellow Danes. And from when the Nazis came in, often a number of things came together, right? So they had, at that point in the war, because later in the war they would divert crazy amounts of resources to rounding up Jews, even when they were like losing. But they wanted Denmark because it was Aryan to be a model, what they called a model protectorate. And from the very beginning, from the king down, the government said, one of their stipulations was, we're not gonna turn over our Jews. And so for several years, the Jews lived there. The Danish government remained in place, but it was a German occupation. And then even the Wehrmacht and the Navy didn't want to do it. They didn't want the trouble of rounding them up. And eventually Hitler himself intervened and said, you're going to round up the Jews. And a German who was a member of the Nazi Party but not an anti-Semite in the occupation government tipped off the Danes. And in this amazing flotilla, over a few weeks, they rowed and moved everyone to Sweden. About 500 Jews were rounded up and taken to Theresienstadt out of 8,000. And every week, the Danish government called Theresienstadt and said, "How are our Jews?" Sent them food, sent them medicine, and so only 50 Danish Jews died during the war.
How many?
Out of 7,200. Why did this? And again, as you mentioned, there were other places. There was the island of Zakynthos in Greece, 100% survival rate. Finland, Albania, which was the only majority Muslim country in Europe. It's sort of a wild. I mean, there's a wild. They had a self-appointed king named Zog who started bringing some Jews there, and he ended up fleeing in an operation that was led by Ian Fleming, wrote James Bond. But they had their code of honor called Besa, and the American ambassador wrote at the time, who was Jewish actually. This is the only country I've seen anywhere that there's absolutely no religious bigotry. And what Besa was is really a code of hospitality. So they would rather die than turn over somebody who was a guest in their home or in their country. And it's the only country in Europe where there were more Jews at the end of the war than at the beginning of the war. And it wasn't because it was like overlooked, because at the Wannsee conference, the Nazis made this very famous list, and they listed all the Jews of Europe, including places where they were occupying and places like England where they weren't. And they listed, this many million in Poland and this many, hundreds of thousands in France. Then they sort of Albania 200. So it was on the radar screen. This was definitely there. So, and Le Chambon, which is a chapter in my book, is a town in the Protestant area of France, which is kind of rare in France, and they were descendants of Huguenots. And the local pastor and his wife was an Italian aristocrat. He was a wealthy, worldly guy from the north of France. He studied in New York. He was the French tutor to the Rockefellers. But they came to this very poor town and this whole plateau, and ended up saving 5,000 Jews, mostly 5,000 people, 3,500 Jews, mostly children. And it gave them, in fact, also, and I've interviewed some of them, a semblance of a normal life. So there were it was a place that if people used to send their children for camp, or there was a school there that was well known. And a lot of the children that were there said they weren't afraid because all these people were protecting them, and they didn't really understand what was going on. So their survival rate was huge. And all of these places, there was almost no one was turned in. It's like, nobody in Le Chambon, nobody in Albania. I mean, I know of one instance in Denmark where that happened. And so I think that was part of it. There's Holland, where Anne Frank had sort of a mixed record, but all in all, the people tended, there were a lot of rescuers there. And there was one of the rescuers after the war quoted, and he said, we were the tip of the spear, but the reason we were able to do this is that people were willing to look the other way. So I think when you have either a culture of protecting people that are on the run, like Le Chambon or like Albania, or mixed with places like Denmark or Le Chambon, where there's this devout ethos, whether it's religion or otherwise, with a willingness of everyone to stand together. I think that was sort of the magic formula that came together. And it is important to think about that, because if we're in an environment where you and I are talking and somebody in the back is rescuing somebody, there were places where everyone here would just ignore it, and that's where people survived. And there were places where people would be running to turn them in, not just the person being rescued, but the rescuer, both of whom would be shot, and you'd get a reward or something like that. And I think that was at the heart of it.
I have one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience, and there's a microphone here that people can line up if you want. But I wanted to just sort of raise a larger issue that I thought about in reading your book, which is not directly addressed in your book, but was kind of raised in the Ken Burns movie that came out in the fall about Americans and the Holocaust, which is, did America do enough to rescue Jews? And, you touch upon, the story of Arian Fry and Hiram Bingham is, the one direct case study where Americans were involved in rescuing Jews. But where do you come out? I'm sure you've thought about that issue a lot over the last couple of years. Where do you come out on that? There were definitely rescue efforts by the U.S. government, especially towards the end of the war. But even those involved in the rescue, I think John Pelly was famously quoted as saying, "Too little, too late." So where do you sort of come out on that kind of long-running historical debate?
I don't think the United States did it. The government did not do enough at all. I know quite a bit about it because I have a cousin who worked for Treasury, and he was Jewish, as was Morgenthau, but he worked in the legal department with Pele and Josiah Dubois, who was these were young lawyers, and by coincidence, late in the war, they came across the fact that we could have gotten out a lot of Hungarian Jews, and money needed to be approved, and the State Department was blocking it. This was the same State Department that punished Bingham and particular guy named Breckinridge Long, but it was pretty endemic. He was in charge of, he had been our ambassador to Rome, loved Mussolini, was a close friend of FDR. And FDR had sort of this kind of, the angel and the devil on his shoulder, but, I think ultimately didn't view, this as a certainly wasn't the reason we went to war. And by the way, you can contrast them, and the historical record on lots of other things speaks differently, but like Herbert Hoover actually was very outspoken very early, and other people were very outspoken about what was going on, and we knew a lot. I mean, there was a pageant that went around called We Shall Never Die, which was, I mentioned it in my book, which went to Madison Square Garden and the Hollywood Bowl, and a lot of very, very famous actors were part of it, including non-Jewish people like Burgess Meredith and Frank Sinatra. And when that went around, they already knew that they'd murdered several million Jews. And so we knew what was going on. We could have done a lot more. I mean, I mentioned the Virgin Islands plan, and Harold Ickes, who was a great guy, who was Secretary of Interior, he very early on, proposed to bring Jews to the Virgin Islands. The Virgin Islands legislature voted unanimously to do this. The governor, who was a U.S. appointee, wanted to do it, and it was blocked by people at state and war, basically on anti-Semitic terms, because the restrictions were, the stipulations, you needed a lot of money. These were going to be, everyone was going to have a sponsor. They were going to be offshore. There was no possible reason that it shouldn't have been allowed. They also looked at using Alaska. So I think the U.S. could have done a lot more. I mean, there's the whole question that Ken Burns, asks, should they have bombed the train tracks to Auschwitz? And for that, I would defer to Elie Wiesel and other people who were there who said absolutely they should have, because at that point, there wasn't, most people there were going to die. I mean, to say that we didn't do this because we didn't want to hurt the prisoners, it was a death camp. So, and I think what I also found in my research that there were, at the end of the war, and I think this is relevant in Ukraine right now, actually, when the Allies did come out and say, like, we will have war crimes tribunals, we will hold people responsible. At the end of the war, a number of people were kind of freaking out. And everyone, by the way, wanted to surrender to a Brit or an American or a Canadian, and not a Russian, for which we can talk about. But it did affect people's behavior at the end of the war. Once they knew they were going to lose, there were people started to think twice about implementing the final solution.
Okay, we're going to go to audience questions now, ma'am.
So with regard to your discussion about American response, there's a book called The Last Million that talks about the fact that after the war, after everyone knew what had happened, the American FDR didn't think he would be able to change the quota system from 1923 to let in more Jews. When I was growing up, I always assumed that after the war, America, threw open the gates to take whoever was left. And my question is, we don't hear that much today. There are swastikas here and there. But do you think that's really changed?
You mean the view of the anti-Semitism?
The anti-Semitism in America.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great book. I know the author's a friend. It actually is on the back of my book, and there's a crazy story he tells, because and this happened right after the war, that we immediately became more interested in the Cold War, and so we ended up having a lot of letting a lot of Nazis out of jail. We brought Werner von Braun here and turned him into a hero, and you had this crazy situation where you had Jews still in camps for several years while we were allowing war criminals, into the large numbers of war criminals into the United States. It was horrible. I think the world's better now than it was then, to be honest with you. I do. The rise of anti-Semitism in the last period of time is very troubling, and its normalization is very troubling. My friend Dave Foxman, who ran the ADL for many years, still said to me that they've been tracking it for years. The people who were with the tiki torches were always there, but what's changed with social media and with certain people in government is that it's been normalized, and there's not and it's on the right and the left, right? So it's and as I think a lot of people know, it's a canary in a coal mine issue. When anti-Semitism is something that extremes can agree on, right? And it usually leads to a bad place. I think the immigration debate is very mischaracterized by both sides, and I do think that there are many people out there, and Mike knows this better than anybody, who are fleeing for their lives that can't get here. And I'm not talking about economic refugees, but people who live. And so So to that extent, I think we're still not doing a good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I was wondering if you could tell me whether or not you came across any stories of Nazi member parties who stopped drinking the Kool-Aid and sort of woke up, and they became rescuers?
Yeah. There are some, and you always question their veracity, but as I mentioned, people's views started to change at the end of the war because they realized they might be in a bit of trouble. Churchill was pretty outspoken about that. He wanted to shoot. He was like, "Why do we even have a tribute?" He changed his mind on that. But whether people had a sincere change is debatable. I mean, Hermann Goering's younger brother, whose father was probably actually of Jewish descent, didn't make him not an anti-Semite. He claimed it probably did rescue a number of Jews. Now, I mean, he wasn't. I don't know if he was a member of the Nazi Party. His brother was number 2 in the government. So he's one that comes to mind. The person, I mean, that in my book that fits this description was Georg Dukowitz, who was the maritime attaché in Copenhagen, and he was, for personal career reasons, like Oskar Schindler, a member of the Nazi Party, and was not an anti-Semite, had Jewish friends. He's different than Schindler because he worked for the government, for the German government, and he became very, very close to the head of the SS, the occupying governor in Copenhagen, because he also spoke fluent Danish, had unbelievable connections with the Danish government. So he had this very special relationship where they used him to kind of as an intermediary, and because of that, he knew when the roundup was going to be, and he went and he kept a diary of this, flying around. First, he tried to stop it, and he flew to Berlin, he flew to Sweden, then he kind of arranged for the Swedes to take the Jews, and then he went to the very highest levels of the Danish government and told them. By the way, in Denmark during the war, even under occupation, the fascist parties got like less than 2% of the vote. So so he knew they were going to be sympathetic. So he was a member of the Nazi Party that is actually kind of directly responsible for that amazing rescue.
Wasn't there at the end of your book, there's an SS officer who kind of helps a young Jewish girl. Maybe it's more to save his own.
That is precisely was to save himself. So this was there's a story of 10 British POWs who saved at the very end of the war a young Jewish girl who kind of ran away from the death march, and when the Russians came, it was chaos, and she the British. She was kind of free, but she went to a house, and the guy answered the door. He was the head of the SS there, and he said to her, she was pretending she wasn't Jewish, and then he said to her, "You speak really good German." And he's like, "You're that Jewish girl that ran away from the death march 3 weeks ago." And she said yes, and thought she was, and then she said, he said, look, we're gonna make a deal, okay? You can stay here, and you're gonna write me a letter that says I saved you, and I'm gonna take that letter and I'm gonna go. They were in Lithuania, and he went as fast as he could west to find an American or a Brit to surrender to, because he was terrified of the Russians. And so that was the deal. And after the war, when she was reunited with her rescuers, and these were British POWs who had been in prison in this area for a few years, one of them said to her, "Oh, that guy, he was the head of the SS. Like any other time, like if it had been a month earlier, he would have like had you killed." So I don't give him a lot of credit. I mean, there are debates that go on about in some of these places that the Wehrmacht and certainly the Navy was less interested in rounding up. They didn't want the trouble. The German aristocrats tended to be people senior in the military over time became anti-Hitler. But I think a lot of them were driven more by questions of practical situation on the ground and the military situation than kind of altruism.
Al, great to see you.
Thank you. I'm a Holocaust survivor, and I deeply appreciate your book and what you're writing. I was born in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands, and I'm here today because a Dutch-Indonesian family and their Indonesian Muslim nanny, who could not read or write or understand the Dutch language, but had a heart of gold and took the risked their lives to save a 9-month-old Jewish baby so he could be here today. I had 2 sisters who were hidden with a Catholic woman, devout Catholic woman, and who had a different fate. The husband denounced his wife to the Nazis as hiding 2 Jewish children. His wife's name was Rosa Mazurowski. My 2 sisters were immediately taken to Auschwitz and were killed. The train that took them to Auschwitz had 215 unaccompanied children. But Rosa Mazurowski, the woman who tried to save them, was also sent to the concentration camps, barely survived, and then offered testimony against the arresting officer, who was a Dutchman. The question I have is there any recognition? Now, the Mabna family that saved me was honored at Yad Vashem, but there's of course no memorial at all to the people who tried and paid dearly for trying to save the lives of Jews, like Rosa Mazurowski. Are you aware of any program to honor the unknown?
First of all, thank you for sharing that story. Very powerful. I think she would actually be probably qualified, eligible for the Righteous Award. I'm not sure that you actually had to have. Well, you do. It does require testimony. I mean, I talk about in the book that the fact that there were rescuers who we don't even know about because they were killed, or I think they're actually Yad Vashem's, my personal opinion, that their criteria are too strict. So I talked about how it's probably a multiple, because Primo Levi even talked about the fact that there was this worker who brought him soup, and every day the guy would bring him soup in Italy, and it made him feel. He said, "The man saved my life." He called it Lorenzo. He still remembered his name. So I think there were many people who tried to help, and many people who paid the ultimate price for doing that. And in some parts of Europe, they would kill your family as well as So I don't know actually the answer on Yad Vashem, but they certainly should be recognized there. But I know there are some efforts here to get more people recognized, including like the circle around Varian Fry. But also there are, I think, some American organizations that recognize people, including Jews who help other Jews, to be honored. But I'd assume you've testified, but I think
yes,
that's a way of making sure that story
Absolutely.
stays out there, and is really important.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for sharing again your story.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question?
One more.
Oh, go for it.
Hi, Richard. I'm going to invite you to comment if you care to, but you mentioned how it was a very small percentage of people who stepped up and were righteous and did the right thing. So I'm curious, what is your assessment, having looked so closely at that period in time and being rooted in this period in time, of our society's ability to impart good moral values, to impart courage, to do the right thing when it's hard? Are we better off than we were in the 1930s and 40s, or about the same, or worse, or would simply welcome your thoughts? Thank you.
I'm an optimist, and I think I like to think we are better off. I think the world has evolved positively. I think there are lots of things. It's not all one step forward, right? All forward. There's steps back, and I think social media has been a very corrosive, scary force, and I think it's really important to try to teach people, particularly children, that it's important to respect and tolerate each other. And I think even if you stand up for someone being bullied at school, I mean, people make fun of that answer, but I really think it actually does make a difference. It helps create these kinds of communities, and I think also who we value as a society is, when you look at that right now, the signs would tell you we're living in very decadent times. But I think it's really important to pay tribute to people who are trying to do the right thing, or who are exhibiting courage, as you put it. I do think, just to follow up, we were talking about the United States during World War II. I do think the United States has been an exceptional country, and I think it's been exceptional to a lot of minorities. I mean, we have a very bad history in some ways, but it's certainly in the last period of time. And certainly for Jewish people, it's been a haven, and I do think again, different cultures act differently. Even at that time, on the one hand, you had a Nazi movement here, which included the architect Philip Johnson. Father Coughlin had 30 million listeners on the radio, but I think the United States still does have this. I think the ethos of the Declaration of Independence and being a free country is really part of our DNA, and I think that there was a reason people wanted to surrender to the Americans or the British even then. So I can't say I'm not troubled. I am, and again, there are people who have a platform now and a microphone that is truly frightening, and I think we're in a moment that feels a lot scarier than it was before, but I do think that we're not anywhere near close to something like the Shoah or World War II, hopefully, but certainly something like the Holocaust happening in a place like the United States.
So Richard, I think ending on a note of optimism is a good thing.
Well, the book is meant to be optimistic. I will
Absolutely.
say it's meant to, again, this is it's a different take on the Holocaust, and it's not to again, it's a horrible moment, but again, I hope this is sort of a ray of light that people can, and that these people get their due by some way through the book.
Absolutely. Well, let's thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Richard, for a great conversation. And I wish you great success in selling a lot of books. And I think they want you to sign
thank
here.
you.
So thanks
Thank you all
everyone
for coming.
Yeah.